morning and happy Sabbath. I was joking this morning, this is going to be the smallest crowd and the largest crowd ever preached before, but I guess it's hard to know how many people are tuning in online. But it's really a great feeling to be back here at church, and of course it's one of those things that you don't know how much you miss it until it's gone. And for me, that's been attending church at Living Faith every Sabbath, and fellowship with God's people is really a necessary part of life. And I've missed the church potlucks as well. But we're going to be studying the book of Esther today, and we're going to look at how the series of events that Esther faced parallel what we're going to go through. So before we begin, let's start with a word of prayer. Dear Jesus, please be with us as we study the book of Esther, and also please be with all the people that are sick with the virus right now. Help them to get well soon, and just please be with us as we face the future events, and help us just to trust in you and know that you're the only answer. In your name, amen. So the title of my sermon is A Revelation of Esther. And across the world, our religious freedoms are being eroded every day. And that's something we hold very dear to our heart, religious liberty, and it's fading and becoming non-existent in many countries. And I have a couple of news articles from a couple of years ago. Most of you guys probably heard about this, but Russia sanctioned the Jehovah's Witnesses a few years ago. And basically they forbid them from meeting, from teaching, and they also seized all their property. And I don't remember exactly how it works, but I think like the Adventist church got there early enough so they were considered part of the Russian culture. So we didn't face the same punishment. And then also in Bolivia, the new penal code may ban evangelism. And it states that whoever recruits, transports, deprives of freedom, or hosts people with the aim of recruiting them to take part in armed conflicts or religious or worship organizations will be penalized 5 to 12 years of imprisonment. And I think there's another church that's already kind of the state church, and of course we all know who that church is. So this is kind of their effort to shut down any other kind of evangelism by Protestants. And recently, during this time of quarantine, some Christians have been unfairly targeted. In Kentucky, you guys might have heard, there's like a group of people having a drive-in church, just like the drive-in movies. And the local sheriff decided to record the license plate of everybody there attending church. And just there's been a lot of harassment lately, and just stuff happening across the country. And some of it's like kind of hard to know what's the right thing to do and not when there's a virus and stuff. But we know from prophecy someday that religious freedom will completely end. And every day you read the news, you can see we're coming closer and closer to that reality. And when it finally ends, I believe there's going to be a number of tumultuous events that will shake the world, such as the latter rain, the shaking, laws against religious freedom, the loud cry. And so today we're going to find out more about those events that we'll someday face by studying Esther. And personally, I've always found Esther to be one of the most fascinating books of the Bible. And it contains an awesome story, but it also has a deep spiritual meaning behind it. And it's interesting, historically, Esther was not always such a popular book. And you guys, I'm sure you heard of Martin Luther, and he called Esther less worthy of being held canonical than any other writing in the Old Testament. And he put it on a list with 2nd Maccabees for books that Judaize too much and contain pagan naughtiness. Well, I'm not sure what kind of pagan naughtiness that Esther has in it, but maybe it was just too exciting of a story, I guess. I don't know. And I believe Mrs. White held the book of Esther in much higher regard, but if you look at her writing, she only wrote the word Esther 66 times. And many of those were for prophets and kings. So I guess back then they just didn't really care about Esther as much as we have, or as we do. So it's neat to know there's a lot more we can learn about this book that maybe even the Adventist pioneers weren't aware of. And maybe part of the reason it was kind of ignored in the past was because it doesn't mention God by name. Instead, it shows how he works behind the scenes. So today we're going to look at some of the final events that are kind of exhibited by the stories in Esther. And we have always stand for God, brought before courts, sealed by the king, the time of Jacob's trouble, and the second coming. And so the first one, always stand for God, is what we need to be doing right now, before these end time events even begin. Though it feels kind of ironic for me saying that because we're in the middle of a pandemic, so it feels like the end time events have already begun. But and I have a couple of verses I found that really just impressed me that we need to, just be ready every single day to face what's ahead of us. And 1 Corinthians says, "Therefore, my beloved brethren, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that your labor is not in vain for the Lord." And in Philippians says, "Only let your conduct be worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or am absent, I may hear of your affairs, that you stand fast in one spirit, with one mind, striving together for the faith of the gospel." And you could spend a lot of time studying those verses, but Corinthians, I like how it says, "Be steadfast, immovable." That means when the winds of doctrine come, we need to look the other way and look to the Bible. And in Philippians, Paul really calls for unity, and I think that's just critical as we face the last day events. And so I identified several places in the book of Esther where people made the right decision and stood for God. And we're going to start in Esther 1, verse 5. If you have your Bible, you can follow along, or I put the verses up on the screen, whatever works better for you guys. And the first place we're going to read about is the feast of King Xerxes. And verse 5 says, "And when these days were expired, the king made a feast unto all the people that were present in Shushan the palace, both great and small, 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace." And then let's jump to 9 and read all the way to verse 12. "Vashti the queen made a feast for the woman in the royal house which belonged to King Ahasuerus. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded the 7 chamberlains that serve in the presence of Ahasuerus the king to bring Vashti the queen before the king with the crown royal, to show the people and the princes her beauty, for she was fair to look on. But the queen Vashti refused to come at the king's commandment by his chamberlains. Therefore the king was very wroth, and his anger burned in him." And it's interesting, if you look at it, there was actually 2 separate feasts. And the king had his own feast, and Vashti had her own feast. And I'm guessing she was seen kind of as a leader for the woman, and maybe even a role model. Then the king asked her to come to this drinking feast and, possibly do something inappropriate. It's hard to know exactly. But I think she really made the right decision here by turning that down. And it doesn't say if she was a Christian at all, but I think she might have had some kind of godly influence in her life. And the second example I have is when Esther was taken as a possible replacement for Queen Vashti. In chapter 2, verse 8, we read, "So it was when the king's command and decree were heard, and when many of the young women were gathered at Shushan the citadel, under the custody of Hegai, that Esther also was taken to the king's palace, and to the care of Hegai the custodian of the woman." And I never really noticed that before, but she was actually taken. And I don't believe it was her desire to be queen. And like a lot of young girls dream of being a Disney princess or something like that. I don't know that Esther had those desires, because Xerxes was not the kind of guy that I don't think any woman would want to marry, really. He was really brutal and violent. And she was forced into this new life, and it required a lot of work and preparation. And we read in verse 12, "Each young woman's turn came to go into King Ahasuerus after she had completed 12 months' preparation, according to the regulation for women. For thus were the days of their preparation apportioned, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with perfumes and preparations for beautifying women." And I think it's pretty admirable of Esther to go through with that, because maybe she felt that God was leading her. I mean, it would have been pretty easy for her, to forget to take a shower or be kind of smelly, and then King Xerxes would have rejected her in a hurry. But she went with what she felt was God's leading. And she went through 12 months of preparation. And we have a lot of preparation for the last days. Someday we'll have to face every trick the devil will throw at us, but we need to get ready. And not by applying perfume, but by a daily application of scripture reading and prayer can we be ready. Amen. And a third example I have of people standing up for God in the book of Esther is Mordecai. In those days, while Mordecai sat within the king's gate, 2 of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, doorkeepers, became furious and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. So the matter became known to Mordecai, who told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king and Mordecai's names. And it seems like Mordecai really went out of his way here. Like as a Jew, he did make enemies among the Persian royalty by, tattletaling on these guys. But he did the right thing and he saved the king's life. And he really played the role as a watchman in the gate. And we also have a role to play as watchmen. And I have a quote from Testimonies 9 I'd like to read that kind of describes what they do. It says, I saw that it was time that the watchmen upon the walls of Zion understood the responsibility and sacredness of their mission. They should feel that a woe is upon them if they do not perform the work God has committed to them. And as a church, sometimes we have people that are warning against certain types of music or entertainment creeping into the church. And sometimes that can get kind of annoying. But the reality is that God called these people to be watchmen, and they're like gatekeepers that are sounding an alarm against worldliness creeping into the church. So the second event we have end time, that's in the end time cycle, is number 2 is brought before courts. And this is the second event. And in chapter 3, Haman had conspired and got God to condemn all the Jews to death. And soon afterwards, Mordecai became very distraught and warned Esther. And so then in chapter 4, verses 15 and 16, and this is the memory verse, he said, For if you remain completely silent this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows if you had come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Then Esther told him to reply to Mordecai, Go, gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan, and fast for me, and neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night nor day. My maids and I will fast likewise. And so I will go to the king, which is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. And living in a pandemic like we are might not be very fun, but I think everybody in this room was born for a time like this, and God has a plan for us. And we could have been born many centuries ago and never even learned about the gospel or anything, but instead he chose to place us in this time period. And we're members of God's last day remnant church just before, all these exciting events take place. And now Esther had to go before the court and face King Xerxes. And I was thinking about it, and I'm like, wait, she'd been preparing a year before, and she'd been before courts before. So she had lots of practice and preparation. So I guess if you're doing jury duty, that's not like really completely going before the court. But I think we really need to prepare and study a lot. And I have a passage from Luke I'd like to read. And it looks like it's a little hard to read, a little small. But Luke says, But before all these things I will lay your hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and prisons. You will be brought before kings and rulers for my name's sake, and it will turn out for you as an occasion for testimony. Therefore settle it in your hearts not to meditate beforehand on what you will answer. And I like those words. Jesus says, settle it in your hearts not to meditate beforehand. I think to settle it in our hearts, we need to decide, now what we're going to do, but also I think it's important to study the Bible so that God can flash the right words into our mouth or for the testimony. Oh, and then I guess I missed the last section of the verses, actually, in the next page. He says, For I will give you a mouth and wisdom which all your adversaries will not be able to contradict or resist. And that sounds very comforting. And I'm sure it's going to be hard for some people to get up into court and imagine being criticized by everybody, put on the media, all the talking heads, going in against you. So number 3 is sealed by the king. And I'm sure you guys have heard about the sealing. And someday those that keep this true Sabbath and have the name of God on their foreheads will receive the seal of God. And we can find something similar to the seal of God in Esther chapter 8, verses 7 and 8. I'm going to read those texts. And then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew, Indeed, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows, because he tried to lay his hands on the Jews. You yourself write a decree concerning the Jews, as you please, in a king's name, and seal it with the king's signet ring. For whatever is written in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet ring, no one can revoke. And this is a pretty amazing proclamation by the king. He pretty much just handed Esther and Mordecai all the power in the kingdom and said, here, just do as you wish. And there's a lot of similarity between this seal and the seal that God's remnant people will receive someday. And the seal on the document granted life to the Jews. Someday, having the seal of God in our forehead will be the only thing that protects us, and those who have the mark will be destroyed. Also, it's interesting that nobody could change what was written with the seal. Once a person receives the seal of God on their forehead, nothing can change it. And that reminded me of that famous verse, Revelation 22:11. He that is unjust, let him be unjust still, and he which is filthy, let him be filthy still. He that is righteous, let him be righteous still, and he that is holy, let him be holy still. And then I have one more quote I found from the Spirit of Prophecy. It says, those who would have the seal of God in their forehead must keep the Sabbath of the fourth commandments. This is what distinguishes them from the disloyal, those who have accepted a man-made institution in the place of the true Sabbath. The observance of God's rest day is a mark of distinction between him that serveth God and him that serveth not. And I don't believe the mark of the beast or the seal of God is come on everybody yet, but someday that will be the final distinction. So the second to last section we're going to look at is number 4, the time of Jacob's trouble. And the Jews went through their own time of trouble during the book of Esther. But I was studying this and I noticed that the worst time for the Jews probably was earlier on when Mordecai first heard of the king's decree. And everything seemed hopeless. They were condemned to death, but they banded together and prayed for Queen Esther as she went before the king. Then all of a sudden their circumstances changed. The queen won the king's favor. And the Jews were permitted to defend themselves and kill their enemies. And Esther 8:11 says, by these letters the king permitted the Jews who were in every city to gather together and protect their lives, to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the forces of any people or province that would assault them, both little children and women, and plunder their possessions. And I don't know if we're going to actually destroy any enemies at the end of time other than spiritual foes. But in the old King James Version, Isaiah says, he shall dwell on high. His place of defense shall be the munitions of rocks. Bread shall be given him. His waters shall be sure. So it's hard to know exactly what happened, but I'm sure we just need to follow God's leading. He'll impress us what to do with that verse when the time comes. And also, I didn't cover this really in the sermon, but really in the last chapter of Esther, chapter 9, there's a time of judgment, really, where the Jews went out and just, acted. They slayed a lot of people, and it was just a time of judgment, and that kind of corresponds to what's coming too. And so that time that the Jews went through reminded me a lot of the greater time of trouble that we'll face. And everything seemed hopeless at first. Everybody's going to be doomed to die. Just like when the first news reports came out about the coronavirus, it seemed like the end of the world. But in some places, things have already started to get better. And I believe during the final time of trouble, there will be some things that, start out kind of dire and awful, and then things will start to look up. And one of the first things that's going to happen is the death decree. And that's in the book of Esther. And in Testimonies 5, we read, the decree which is to go forth against the people of God will be very similar to that issued by Ahasuerus against the Jews in the time of Esther. And I believe that this decree will help trigger a lot of other events like the 7 last plagues. And each one of those, we can count to 7. Each one of them would be like, oh, Jesus is coming sooner. It's just about to all get over, and that's going to be so cool. And that makes me kind of want to memorize them in the order. And it reminds me of this Bible verse. When these things come to pass, I don't know if I had it enough. Then look up and lift up your heads, for your redemption draweth nigh. And then there's some of the very last events that are going to take place. We can read about them in the Great Controversy. A hand holding the 10 Commandments suspended in the sky for the whole world to see. A mighty earthquake that shakes the earth. The sound of trumpets. And the sun shining in its full strength at midnight. And so we have a lot to look forward to, though it does sound a little bit scary. So number 5, the final event is the second coming. And this is portrayed in Esther 8:15-17, where Mordecai appears to be a type of Jesus. I don't know that he was a type of Jesus for the whole book of Esther. That might have been more Esther taking that role. But we read in 8:15-17, "For Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal apparel of blue and white, with a great crown of gold and a garment of fine linen and purple. And the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. The Jews had light and gladness, joy and honor. And in every province and city, wherever the king's command and decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a holiday. Then many of the people of the land became Jews, because fear of the Jews fell upon them." So, in this kind of parable story, King Xerxes represents God the Father in the book of Esther. Though it does seem a little bit strange, but that's how it works. And he has the power to make life or death decisions that are permanent. So Jesus is about to leave the presence of God the Father and come to his people, just like Mordecai left the king. And then there's going to be eternal celebration and rejoicing. And also there's a lot of symbolism associated with those colors he was wearing, like blue and white and purple and gold. And another similarity is that in heaven every day, everybody will be spiritual Jews. And everybody will love and worship Jesus. It'll be a wonderful thing. And I think that was something we've never really experienced, to have a totality of fellowship with everyone we know and see every day. Like imagine if you're at the grocery store and anybody could be somebody that would pray for you. Or, talk to you about how wonderful Jesus was. And that would just be kind of different than the world is today. That'd be really great. So I have a couple verses I'd like to read before we close that describe the second coming. And I'm sure you guys have heard these before. They're some of my favorites. 1 Thessalonians. "For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of an archangel, and with the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive and remain shall be caught up, together with them in the clouds, to meet the Lord in the air. And thus we shall always be with the Lord." Amen. And then one more verse or passage. Job. "For I know that my Redeemer lives, and he shall stand at last on the earth. After my skin is destroyed, this I know, that in my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see for myself, and my eyes shall behold and not another. How my heart yearns within me." And I'm sure we have a lot of yearning for that day in ourselves as well. And so lately, because of this quarantine and viruses, we've been separated from each other. But someday we'll all be together again, and I'm really looking forward to that day. Amen. The closing hymn is number 205, "Gleams of the Golden Morning."